Everyone, and welcome to Darkscape. So, I apologize for one thing, the stuttering you're going to see in this video. This area is very, very stuttery, and we'll just say that that causes some serious editing issues because Premiere really doesn't like that. So this is the third attempt at actually recording this area, but we're gonna make it work. I'm doing something in editing to help to alleviate the stuttering that you're going to see on your end, but you're still going to notice it. So anyway, let's get down to it. This is Darkscape, the second cut area that we're going to be looking at. And despite the name sounding like, oh my god, some sort of kind of, horrific alternate dimension-like location, it is actually an internal name. And what an internal name is a name used by developers to describe a location's function or otherwise its role in development. Because the other term that's often used is a vanity name, and those are given to places when they're basically finished. When everything else has been said and done and everything works properly, those aren't really necessary until everything is done, which is why that's when they're given. Aside from that, you don't need to actually name areas like that until they're finished. So what you often come across when in areas that are cut before they're actually, fully fleshed out and finished, is that they'll have silly sounding names, or names that otherwise don't make sense unless you know what they are supposed to mean. And Darkscape is actually what's known as a portmanteau, a combination of two terms. And they belie its function. In this case, Darkscape is a combination of Dark Valley and Escape, because that was exactly what it was supposed to be. Back when it was originally going to be in Shadow of Chernobyl, it was a map that you were going to use to escape from Dark Valley. So that's literally what it was going to be, so that's what it was called. And the name kind of stuck in the Stalker community. Everyone decided that that's what it was going to be called. If it was finished and actually put into the game officially, one would expect it to maybe be called like Crescent Valley or Crescent Moon Road or something like that, but they decided that, its internal name, its testing name, was good enough because it sounds kind of cool. So, Darkscape is an area that's very interesting for a number of reasons. It's actually fairly empty in terms of its features. It doesn't have like a lot of buildings or a lot of places to visit like some other areas, and we'll get onto why that is in a few. But the reason it's interesting is because it doesn't just represent a map that was cut. It's also a bit of an interesting kind of exercise in what could have been for the first Stalker. Because as well as being a map that was cut, it also represents two other maps that were cut along with it that are not in the game at all. They were not restored by any mods that I'm aware of. And an entire set of game mechanics. So, looking at the map, if you want to actually see what the game mechanics were, you can pretty easily figure them out. You'll notice that the map has a lot of very wide spaces. It's got things along the side of the road. It's got these explosive barrels stacked everywhere. It's got barricades in the road, like this one right up here. It's got people shooting at me from every which way. It's got anomalies all along the road. It's got a lot of spaces that are too wide for a person to need to fit through. Like, the scale is different from other Stalker maps. You don't need spaces that wide to fit through. Wait, and pop. Yeah. And later on, you'll also see there are box pyramids set up that are obviously odd compared to other areas. What in the world is that guy doing over there? And it turns out what those are actually meant to be, what they represent, is one specific thing. This map was meant to be driven through. Because what this map actually was for is vehicle mechanics. The first Stalker was actually going to have driving in it. A lot of people don't know that, but you were originally going to be able to get in and drive vehicles. in Shadow of Chernobyl. There were vehicles along roads that you were meant to be able to climb into and just take along with you. And this area was presumably where those mechanics were meant to be introduced, like the first time that you were going to actually have those. I don't have any proof of that, but I would assume that this fairly early stage in the game, that this map was meant to be kind of the first time those would have shown themselves. And this is a map this was a map clearly meant for those. What was that? I guess the military's helped me clear this place out. I'll take that, thank you. And what turns out has happened here is, in restoring this map, the Team Epic guys for Call of Chernobyl have basically left it mostly intact and have shown what are basically scars of previous mechanics that were going to be in the game. Mechanics that would have been present were this map to have been officially released with the vanilla Shadow of Chernobyl experience. And instead, what we see them now as is a what could have been. Which, I don't know about you, but I always find really interesting, because there are lots of games out there that have things that are cut from them, and it's cool to see little bits and pieces here and there that may have been left in that show this was clearly meant for that. And here we have an entire map that is entirely built for the express purpose of being driven through, with vehicle mechanics that are no longer present. Like this, for instance, this is a clear example of that. This is one of those box pyramids I was talking about, an entire stack of boxes that is obviously meant to be driven through. I mean, this basically screams, drive through me with a car, and watch what happens. And even the area that it's in, the scale is different, like how these fences are very far apart. This is a different scale than most maps. Normally these would be a lot narrower because you're meant to walk through it in most Stalker maps, but in this case they're a lot wider because you're meant to drive through it. And this entire path right here just says, drive through me. And you can tell that this whole map was built for that, which is kind of cool to see, actually, because none of the other maps in the game have features like that, that say, that belie that purpose, really. So the vehicle mechanics have been actually restored, as I'm sure some of you know, in some mods. Mods like Lost Alpha, I believe. I've never played it, but I believe they do have drivable vehicles in that mod. And also, Stalker Soup has them, and I think it's, if I remember correctly, it's sort of prequel mod dealy. People Soup, before it became Stalker Soup, also had them, although they were a little more janky there. And of course, where do you think those mechanics came from? Where do you think the code for the vehicle driving actually originated from? Well, those modders didn't just magic it up out of nowhere. They're basically resurrecting the half-finished code left in the engine by the devs when they abandoned the idea. Or had to scrap the idea, rather. Probably due to time and budget constraints. And are sort of necromancing the somewhat janky driving physics and everything, and making it available to use in their mods. That's where it comes from. And in the mods, it tends to work only halfway, and I think this is probably relevant to the reason why it was actually scrapped in the first place. If you've ever played one of those mods that you can drive in, pretty much the only thing that's a constant about the driving physics in Stalker is that they're completely ridiculous. They never make any sense. Driving a vehicle is very prone to crashing the game a lot of times. The physics usually are completely just hilarious. You can like hit a tree at like 6 miles an hour, and 50% of the time you'll be okay, and the other 50% of the time you might end up like just being flung off in the other direction at about 1,000 miles an hour and end up in a completely different map, or end up under the ground somehow or something like that. It's clear that they're unfinished and they don't quite work right. Your car might flip strangely because you hit like a 1-inch bump in the road. The physics don't work right, basically, is what I'm trying to say. They're very odd in how they operate. And I think that this is possibly part of the reason why they were cut in the first place. The devs possibly couldn't actually get the driving physics and the mechanics in general to actually function in a reasonably stable manner in time for release. So they had to scrap the idea entirely. And along with the mechanics, of course, they had to get rid of the maps that went along with them. And that includes this one. Sorry about the stuttering once again. Now, how this was originally going to work in Shadow of Chernobyl is you were... wrong button, idiot. Go to the map here. This, of course, is the very large map of Darkscape. You're originally going to be up here in Dark Valley and then go through here and escape out to Cordon. Now, technically, in the story, you still do, in the vanilla game, go out of Dark Valley and end up over here in this abandoned tunnel area in the Cordon, which is strange, because you exit here and end up here, which makes very little sense at first, until you realize that there was originally going to be a big map right here, which technically is still here, even in the vanilla game, you just don't go to it. So, this is why. And how this was originally going to work was supposed to be an almost action movie-esque high-speed escape scene. It was basically a military chase. You had pissed everyone off in Dark Valley, and were running through Darkscape with the military on your ass the entire time. There were military personnel chasing you with like machine guns and RPGs at various checkpoints, trying to blow up your car. There were barricades set up in the road to help stop you. You had to drive around and kind of be on your toes the whole time. There was a Hind helicopter in the sky that would be trying to plug you the entire way through. And your car could even get damaged and destroyed along the way, and there were various other vehicles, as you can see here, kind of examples of, but there were going to be more, along the side of the road that you could escape from your destroyed vehicle and climb into, climb into other vehicles on the side of the road as quick as you could so as not to get shot by the helicopter in the sky, and then resume your escape in a newly not quite so blown up car. Which is kind of neat, to be honest. And even here, this place is pretty cool. This is a little gas station at the near the end of the map, kind of right before the final stretch straight away into the Cordon exit. And there were going to be some zombies here that would kind of be a final bid to help stop you from getting there. They would, of course, spray at you wildly and probably be fodder to hit with your car, because let's be honest, everyone would try to do that. Like, everyone would want to try and run them over with your car, because they're zombies and you're in a car. What else are you going to do to them? And that was the idea of this map, a sort of adrenaline-pumping, high-speed chase that you were meant to spend as little time in as possible on your first run-through, because you were just being assaulted the entire map. You were supposed to go through quickly and not die, basically. In Call of Chernobyl, it's an interesting map because, of course, they had to do something with it to make it still fun, because it's quite spread out with very few landmarks, and you can't drive anymore, so they had to do something. So they made it frequented by many opposing factions. You can have loners, military, bandits. I've seen duty and freedom in here. I've seen military in here. My last playthrough, military had basically taken over this entire, gas station section. Mercenaries in this gas station section. Just lots of them, rather. And this entire area right here, actually, on the map, oh my god, this area right here is a huge conflict area, because you have this place right here, which is an abandoned cabin that you can sleep in, this gas station, the entrance over here, where people commonly walk from the Cordon, and a bandit camp over here. So this entire area is often where flare-ups happen, and long-range, almost like Arma-esque long-range combat occurs. And this is kind of a flashpoint area. If conflict is going to happen in this particular map, this is where it tends to occur, aside from over there by the railway bridge. And this is actually a really fun place for fights to happen, because you have a lot of cover here of various kinds. You've got trees and forests, and you've got the gas station here. You've got the downed helicopter over there, which you don't want to get too close to because there are lots of electrodes and stuff around it. You've got that tunnel over there. It's actually a really cool place. And there are lots of very fun like firefight situations to be had here. I would imagine if you're using Warfare and you go to this place, it's actually one of the more enjoyable places to fight because of how spread out it can be. if you're using some like long-range weaponry and stuff like that, it can be a really fun area. But I've never actually used Warfare, so I wouldn't know that. As far as exploration of it goes, even though it's quite empty, it's actually interesting because I've mentioned some of the landmarks already. You also have a lot of these weird kind of orphaned anomalies along the road, as well as you saw on the map there, some actual anomalous zones to explore for artifacts. The road is actually quite dangerous with all of these various anomalies and radioactive vehicles along it. Explosive barrels littered around the place, of course, and lots of mutants that spawn, large packs of mutants, especially dogs and boars, the occasional flesh, and I've even seen some snorks here as well. So the Call of Chernobyl iteration of it is pretty neat. It retains the marks of what it used to be for, which is really cool to see, while still making it interesting in its own way for what it has to be now, which I think is important for a mod that doesn't have driving, because the driving physics are ridiculous. And another thing I should mention, of course, is I said earlier there used to be 2 other maps regarding the driving mechanics that were cut along with this one. That is true. They also had internal names like this one. They were combinations of the maps that they were meant to connect together. And, what in the world was that? Hello, glowy thing. It's like having a stroke, I don't see it. Anyway, one of them was a rather windy road through a heavily forested area that was kind of meant to test out the cornering and otherwise like straightaway long distance physics of vehicles. I hear boars. I don't see boars. Oh. And it was called Milrad. And that is, of course, another combination of words, and because it was meant to connect military warehouses and radar. Which, of course, military warehouses in most English translations is now known as army warehouses, but it's the same area. And radar is a bit of a weird one. It is technically what became Red Forest in the vanilla Shadow of Chernobyl experience, but is also a separate cut map in a weird way. I'll talk more about that when I visit it later. And then there was another map called Dead Mill that was a sort of countryside-esque map that was meant to connect Dead City and military warehouses, as you can tell by the name. It was fairly barren, but very hilly, very lots of verticality and peaks and valleys in it, and it was quite narrow, but extremely long, like hideously long. It would have taken forever to go through unless you had a vehicle. It was expressly meant for that purpose. Now, these maps are not in the mod. They're not in Call of Chernobyl. They haven't been restored at all, and I think that's mainly because there's no point, really. Darkscape is actually quite interesting, and it has other features, but these maps were specifically just for going through with a vehicle, and that's it. I don't know if they were ever meant to be used by players. I have a feeling that they were actually internal maps meant for testing the vehicle physics, and that even if, let's just say, theoretically, that the vehicle physics ended up being developed properly, they worked just fine, and they were in the final game, and Shadow of Chernobyl had Darkscape and had vehicle driving in it, these 2 maps probably still wouldn't have actually been there. Because I think they were meant to be developer spaces. World spaces only visible by the devs, specifically for the testing of the vehicles while they were implementing them, and not actually meant to be used by players. It's possible that they were meant to be eventually, like, multiple maps were going to have these areas to traverse between them for player usage, but I'm not sure. It's interesting. One of the reasons I say this is because if you look here on the PDA, even in the vanilla game, the non-modded version of Shadow of Chernobyl, you have this valley crescent road here on the PDA. It's not labeled and you can't go to it, but it's still there. You also have Dead City up here. As soon as I can scroll. That's still there. Again, it's not labeled and you can't visit it, but it's there on the PDA. However, the areas in between them are just these slight little areas that don't resemble what actually would have been the maps, which makes me think that they weren't necessarily actually implemented into the game officially, if you get what I mean. Like, even cut areas are still on the PDA, but the other, Millrad and Dead Mill, don't really appear to match up with the areas that are here, that are just sort of for appearances, to give some space in between the locations. The areas, as far as I've seen them, don't look like this. They look quite different than that, which almost makes me think that they were specifically developer spaces, kind of like Testing Hall in the Elder Scrolls games and things like that. But I don't really have any proof one way or the other, it's just a theory. So anyway, yeah, that's Darkscape, a pretty interesting area that represents an entire set of mechanics that could have been, and you can see the marks of them everywhere you go in this map. So I hope you enjoyed the tour that I've given of it, walking along the main road, and the story that went along with it. And, of course, you can, again, check in the description below for a link to the mods that I'm using in this series of videos. They're sorted by load order, and they are all linked to the ModDB pages for them. Am I gonna get shot by these guys? No, I'm not. And also, if you have any other questions, feel free to ask, and I will try to answer them to the best of my ability. You can join me next time, when we will most likely be taking a look at radar, which is an interesting idea because it is not technically a cut area so much as it is an altered area, but we'll get more into that when we actually get there. So, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.